Welcome to Newsbeacon, your trusted source for breaking headlines, global insights, and sharp analysis from around the world. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. For decades, the world watched China and Russia grow closer, forging a relationship that drew the attention of global powers and analysts alike. Their alliance was not born from shared values or ideologies, but from a convergence of mutual interests and pragmatic needs. Together, their partnership served as a strategic counterweight to U.S. dominance, with both nations seeking to reshape the global order and promote a multipolar world where no single country could dictate terms. China, rapidly transforming into the world's manufacturing powerhouse, needed a steady supply of raw materials and energy to fuel its economic engine and sustain its growth. Russia, rich in oil, gas, and minerals, needed reliable markets for its exports, especially as Western sanctions and shifting alliances threatened its traditional trade routes. This economic synergy allowed both countries to reduce their reliance on the West, forging new trade routes and agreements that benefited their respective economies. The no-limits friendship, boldly declared just before the 2022 Ukraine invasion, seemed to cement their bond and signal a new era of cooperation to the world. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin's personal rapport projected unity and strength, helping to smooth over disagreements and present a united front on the global stage. Yet, beneath the surface, the relationship was always unequal. China's economy soared to new heights, while Russia's stagnated, creating a growing imbalance. Beijing emerged as the clear senior partner, especially in economic matters, with Russian officials often deferring to their Chinese counterparts. This imbalance was a persistent undercurrent, quietly shaping their interactions and negotiations, even as they publicly celebrated their partnership. The strength of their alliance was always conditional. National interests and self-preservation came first, and both sides knew it. As global pressures mounted, with sanctions, conflicts, and shifting alliances, the true limits of this so-called no-limits friendship would soon be put to the test. In the end, even the closest alliances have boundaries, especially when questions of power, prosperity, and national survival are at stake. The so-called no-limits partnership between China and Russia soon faced its first real test, a challenge that would reveal just how fragile even the strongest alliances can be when confronted with global upheaval. That test came with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a move that sent shockwaves through the international community and put Beijing in an unexpectedly difficult position. What Chinese leaders initially expected to be a swift and decisive conflict quickly turned into a drawn-out, unpredictable crisis, complicating Beijing's carefully balanced foreign policy and raising new questions about its global role. The war's impact rippled through global markets, causing volatility and uncertainty. For China, this meant navigating a diplomatic minefield, especially as European nations grew increasingly wary of Beijing's stance. Chinese banks and major tech firms became increasingly cautious, worried about the threat of Western sanctions that could jeopardize their international business and financial stability. Although trade with Russia did increase, it was largely limited to China purchasing discounted Russian energy. This was more a matter of economic opportunity than a sign of deepening trust or strategic alignment. Beijing was careful to avoid providing advanced technology or military aid to Moscow, wary of crossing red lines that could provoke a harsh response from the West and further isolate China on the world stage. Behind the scenes, major Chinese companies quietly scaled back their Russian operations, prioritizing continued access to lucrative Western markets over loyalty to Moscow. The risks of openly supporting Russia, economic, diplomatic, and reputational, began to outweigh any potential benefits, forcing Chinese leaders to reconsider their approach. Throughout the crisis, China's top priority remained clear: safeguarding its own economic stability, maintaining growth, and protecting its global reputation as a responsible power. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly apparent that the conflict was a liability for Beijing. Chinese officials began to subtly distance themselves from Moscow, offering only cautious, non-committal statements. China recalibrated its approach, providing rhetorical support to Russia in public, but drawing clear lines in practice to avoid deeper entanglement. The cracks in the partnership widened, exposing the reality that national self-interest, not shared ideology, ultimately guides Beijing's decisions. By signaling to Europe and the wider world that its own interest would always come first, China sought to reassure key partners and protect its global standing. The no-limits friendship, once touted as unbreakable, now had very visible and very real limits for all to see. Europe's response to Russia's invasion was swift and unified, surprising many. The EU and UK imposed sweeping sanctions, targeting Russia's banks, energy and technology sectors. Europe began cutting its reliance on Russian energy, enduring economic pain to uphold its values. Military and financial support for Ukraine surged, with even neutral countries sending aid. NATO expanded, revitalized by the crisis, sending a clear message to Moscow and Beijing. Europe's resolve forced China to reconsider its stance, wary of risking its own ties with the continent. The lesson was clear: Europe would pay a high price to defend its security. China now faced direct pressure. Deeper support for Russia could cost it dearly in Europe. China's economic rise depended on global integration, especially with the EU and US. The Ukraine war and Europe's reaction created new risks for Beijing. Supply chains were disrupted, and European trust in China eroded. Companies began shifting investments to other countries, accelerating a trend away from China. The strategic partnership with Russia offered some benefits, but the costs of alienating Europe were far greater. Chinese leaders recognized that prosperity depended on Western markets, not a sanctioned Russia. Beijing limited its support for Moscow, positioning itself as a potential mediator. This was pragmatism, not principle. China sought to protect its own interests. The balancing act grew harder as global pressures mounted. China tried to maintain ties with both Russia and Europe, but the risks kept rising. Economic self-preservation, not ideology, guided Beijing's choices. When Western nations imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, the effects rippled far beyond their intended target, creating a complex global web that ensnared even companies in third countries, including China. These so-called secondary sanctions forced Chinese companies into a difficult position, making them choose between maintaining business with Russia or preserving access to lucrative Western markets. The mere threat of being cut off from the global financial system was enough to make Chinese banks and tech giants overhaul their compliance systems, scrutinizing every transaction and reducing their exposure to Russian clients. For many, the risk of losing access to Western markets or the all-important dollar system was simply too great, a potential blow that could devastate their international operations and long-term growth. European officials didn't stop at warnings. They directly cautioned Beijing about the dangers of supplying Russia with dual-use goods that could aid its military. Some smaller Chinese firms soon found themselves sanctioned, serving as a stark warning to others that consequences would swiftly follow for aiding Russia's war effort, no matter how indirect the support. This mounting pressure forced Beijing to take action, compelling the government to police its own companies more strictly and to tighten export controls to avoid further international backlash. Supporting Russia now carried the risk of severe retaliation from the West, so protecting Chinese firms and their global interests became the government's top priority. The intricate web of sanctions left China with little room to maneuver, making every business decision fraught with risk and uncertainty. What was once described as a no-limits partnership between China and Russia was now clearly constrained by harsh economic realities and the threat of further sanctions. Beijing's support for Moscow became increasingly cautious and calculated, with every move weighed against potential fallout. Europe's actions effectively forced China to make a choice: prioritize economic stability and global integration, or stand in solidarity with Russia and risk isolation. As a result, the scope of the partnership shrank, with China putting its own economic future and global standing above all else. In the end, the sanctions web didn't just restrict Russia, it effectively turned China into a reluctant enforcer of Western rules, reshaping the dynamics of global trade and diplomacy. China's foreign policy is a high-wire act, balancing its partnership with Russia against vital Western ties. In global forums, Beijing avoids condemning Moscow, echoing Russian narratives while stressing sovereignty. China presents itself as neutral, even proposing peace plans, but skepticism abounds. As the war drags on, China's neutrality is harder to maintain, especially as global consequences mount. Europe's unified stance has raised the stakes, making clear that future relations hinge on China's actions. Beijing cannot support Russia's war and expect business as usual with Europe. The diplomatic tightrope is growing thinner. China's attempts to please both sides satisfy neither. The cost of missteps is rising, and Beijing is learning it can't have it all. The war has exposed the limits of China's balancing act. Europe's pressure is forcing China to choose partnership or prosperity. For the Kremlin, the war's outcome has been isolation and dependency. Russia's failed blitz in Ukraine led to a grinding conflict and global ostracism. China became Russia's economic lifeline, buying energy and supplying goods. But this lifeline came at a cost. Russia now sells at discounts and cedes leverage to Beijing. The power dynamic shifted. Russia is the junior partner, reliant on China's goodwill. Moscow's dependence is a source of unease, as China's support grows more conditional. Every cautious move from Beijing signals Russia's predicament. The no-limits partnership is now defined by China's interests, not Russia's needs. China won't abandon Russia, but it won't sacrifice its own prosperity either. For Moscow, isolation is deepening, and its most powerful friend is proving to be a cautious one: the reality. Russia needs China far more than China needs Russia. The limits of their friendship are now unmistakable. The China-Russia rift is reshaping global supply chains and alliances. Companies are moving production out of China, seeking security over cost. New winners emerge: Vietnam, India, Mexico, while China tries to avoid being labeled a risk. The crisis has revitalized Western alliances, with NATO expanding and the EU acting with new purpose. The US is strengthening Indo-Pacific partnerships to counterbalance China. China's caution on Russia is partly to avoid further isolation. The world is fragmenting into competing blocs, ending the era of easy globalization. Countries must now navigate a more complex competitive landscape. The China-Russia-Europe triangle is central to this new order. The ripple effects are global, touching businesses and governments everywhere. The global power balance is shifting, with China, Russia, and the West locked in a complex rivalry. The dream of a Sino-Russian axis challenging the West is fading, replaced by pragmatism. China prioritizes its own economic interests, keeping Russia at arm's length. The future will be defined by three-way competition, not a simple Cold War split. The West is unified, Russia is weakened, and China is cautious, each vying for influence. Nations in the global South will try to stay non-aligned but face tough choices. Economics, not ideology, is driving realignment. Europe's firm response showed its power to impose costs. The New World Order is fragmented, competitive, and unpredictable. Flexible alignments will shape the future.